offended if you are. And it surprised me when she would ask people, they'd say, if you had a blackout, they say, well, I've never had one, or I had one in college and it so horrified me that, I never drank that much again. And it reminded me of the old AA days when, these old seasoned rummies, few of them had blackouts. Most of them had never had the DTs. And I always thought, am I in the wrong gang? Is there a Wino Anonymous? And finally, my number is called, and I go up there, and, Miss James is checking me out. And she had that, that schoolmarm vibe to her. And she said, well, number 26, what do you do? And I said, well, I grew and sold pot for 30 years, and now I write and illustrate memoirs. And she said, oh, would I have read them? I said, absolutely not. But I turned to the jurors behind me. I said, if any of you are interested, my first one is called High and Dry, and it's on Amazon, which it isn't anymore, by the way.
It's on Hell's Press now,
yeah,
right?
And they sort of snickered, and I turned back to her, and, she was obviously not amused, and she said, so you're a drinker then, number 26? I said, well, I was years ago, but, I've quit for a long time. And she said, did you ever have a blackout? And I said, yeah, I'd say at least 400 to 500 of them. Probably on the high end of that, because I said, it's not like winos keep score. And she said, well, how do you feel about that? How did you know that you'd done something and the next day you didn't even know what it was? That must have been terrible. And I said, the only time I ever regretted blackouts was when I was in the DTs. Because when you're in the delirium tremens, it's so scary and so awful that you want to know every second of everything that got you there. But I said, other than that, I kind of like blackouts. And she said, you liked blackouts? And I said, yeah, I said, I never raped or killed anyone, as far as I know. And I said, think about it, it's fascinating.